All right, what's up, everyone? It's another episode of Your Lady Speaking, Amy the Seventh, aka Pretty Woman Speaks. And joining me today is none other than Reverend Dr. Earle J. Fisher. He and I share the same hometown, Benton Harbor, Michigan. And then we both met up in Memphis. During the civil rights speech of Reverend Jesse Jackson, he was in town for the assassination. Um, Commemoration of Dr. Martin Luther King last year of 2022. I got up there and spoke and just basically said a few things and remember that Jesse Jackson had marched in Benton Harbor a few times, and then he just pulled me to the side and said, "Yo, I'm from Benton Harbor. It's such a small world, especially when you put yourself out there." And since then, it's been such a pleasure to learn about him. He's also the senior pastor of none other that's been the blackest church in Memphis, Abyssinian Memphis Baptist, excuse me, Abyssinian Baptist Church in Memphis. Um, he's also he has his doctorates in philosophy, got his master's in divinity. He's also a computer science nerd. Might as well say he has his bachelor's in that as well. Black men achieving, he's all of that. He's also a social and political justice spearheading. He started nine up the vote 901 in 2017, where he empowers people to get out there and vote. And then he's also really big on social justice, especially when it comes to Black men having fatal encounters with police. I know that all too well, especially since we both come from Benton Harbor. If y'all don't know where Benton Harbor is,
Man, listen.
let's start there. You want to tell us where we're located?
Well, look, I want to first thank you, Amy the Seventh. I'm gonna call you Amy the Seventh today. We're
Yes.
gonna stick with your stage name. But I want to thank you for the opportunity to chop it up with my dear sister from the beautiful city of Benton Harbor. And I thank you for telling that story about how we first interacted. I also want to salute you for your prayerful perseverance and getting back to the place where you are doing this podcast and other things that are on the horizon. It's always good to see folks from the hometown standing up on behalf of the hometown and doing some great things. So I thank you for that. Benton Harbor is located in the southwest corner of Michigan. It's 90 miles east of Chicago. And so I often say, Amy, that Michigan is Benton Harbor, Saginaw, Detroit, Flint, and Mississippi.
We definitely.
So we come from, yeah, we come from, one of, if not the blackest cities in the state. And also, and we don't say this to brag, we say this to set context, one of the most impoverished cities in the country. And so often, those of us who come through those trenches, when you make it out, you say, number one, you never forget where you come from. And number two, if you can make it in Benton Harbor, you can make it anywhere. So I think we always take that with us. I've taken it with me when I came to Memphis on the basketball scholarship to the HBCU here at Lemoyne College. And, anybody who knows anything about Benton Harbor, they know it's a basketball city too. And so,
Okay.
yeah, I'm certified. Like I could hoop
Listen
for
now.
real, for real. I ain't just talking about hooping. I mean, you got Wilson Chandler, you got Robert Whaley, Kerry Hartfield, Anthony Pig Miller. The list goes on and on. And I know I'm leaving some names out, even of some people who, I'm contemporaries of. But at the end of the day, if you were able to come up and get respect on the basketball court in Benton Harbor, then you were probably able to go, somewhere anywhere in the country and represent and hold your own. And so I was able to do that in Memphis. And little did I know that God had larger plans outside of the scope of athletics. So by the time I get here and encounter some of the younger preachers in Memphis and have become very close friends with some of them, they helped me shape, my spirituality in ways that it may have been seeds planted while I was in Benton Harbor, but they were definitely watered and have begun to bear some fruit in Memphis. And so I've been pastoring Abyssinian Baptist Church since 2011. And I've been, on the forefront, as you mentioned, of some of the most notable social justice efforts and initiatives in Memphis and Shelby County and around the country over the last several years. So again, I'm glad to be representing for the home team like you are, and I'm especially glad to be part of the podcast today.
Okay. I mean, that's such a beautiful introduction. Let's just say he did name drop, but look, Benton Harbor may be one of the smallest towns, one of the blackest towns in Michigan. But when I say that there is no other small town that can compete with the amount of talent that has come out of Benton Harbor, not only did he name Wilson Chandler and Robert Whaley, we also have Ernie Hudson from the Sinbad, the comedian. I mean, even Biblical A. Fox dad taught in our school system. That's just how bad Benton Harbor is on the map. And I'm really glad that with this podcast, we can actually discuss some of the beauty that has come out of Benton Harbor. I know that one of the things that really put us in the focal front was back in 2003, where prior to Ferguson, a lot of like New York Times and even CNN, when Ferguson happened in 2014, they went back to Benton Harbor in our riot that happened in 2003 when Terrence Shern, aka T-shirt, yes, he was involved in a fatal encounter. He actually just had a simple speeding ticket. Police chased him through the neighborhood and he ended up dying on his motorcycle.
Late June 2003, Terrence Shern, a young black male on a motorcycle, chased by white police. He crashed and was killed. What followed was 2 days of rioting, 300 law enforcement personnel, and more than 20 buildings destroyed by arson.
Talking to my teammates from New Orleans or from Milwaukee or some from Chicago, and trying to explain to them the depth of the despair and the depravity, but also what Memphis would call the grit and the grind, or that ethic of resistance that was prevalent in Benton Harbor. They did not get the full scope of what I was trying to say until the riots happened when T-shirt died, So, that was one of the moments where people all around the country who knew someone from Benton Harbor was able to put into perspective exactly what that meant for the people who they have been encountering all of this time from, as you described it, that very small city full of all manner of beauty and talent, and also full of all manner of exploitation and oppression too. So, that's the belly of the beast, and all of the Black ingenuity that is cultivated in spaces like that, I think, was put on display and continues to be put on display since that happened. But there were also riots in the 60s, race riots in the 60s that a lot of people don't know about. It used to be taught in Benton Harbor public schools, but it's no longer taught. So I got that game from, my uncle, John Fisher, and, some of my elders and ancestors who were telling me about the racial tensions in Benton Harbor at the time. And that also kicked off because there were some white police officers, as I understand it, that shot and killed a young kid that was engaged in some kind of protest too in the 60s. And so, when you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And even worse, when you don't know the history, it's hard to interpret accurately what's happening in the present.
I mean, that's so true. One thing about Benton Harbor, we're known as like the Tale of Two Cities. Actually, there was a book written by a white man called The Tale of Two Cities, or maybe Tale of Two Rivers. One of the things like that. Maybe I have to look it up. But basically, the book was about Benton Harbor shares a river, St. Joseph River, between the whitest city, St. Joe, and of course, Benton Harbor, which is the blackest city. And just across the bridge, there is racial disparities that are really deep when it comes to finances, when it comes to property ownership. In fact, a lot of ticketing and everything, you have to go across the bridge to the white side just to pay off your tickets. And so there was a lot of things coming up where at one point in time, a lot of bodies, Black bodies, were being found in the river. And so the author depicts about how a lot of those accused would get away from it by drowning those bodies in the river and then running off and hiding back among their peers in St. Joseph. And that tends to be an issue that continues to surface now, where we have police brutality all over the country, and then those officers tend to throw a rock and then hide their hand among their black and blue uniforms. And so when we take a trip from Benton Harbor to Memphis, where we set up that T-shirt where they would say kind of predates Ferguson and set up how Ferguson actually kind of boiled to the surface when Mike Brown died, and then they similarly rioted the same way Ben Harbor did. And then we go down to Memphis, and where Dr. Fisher comes into play when he really started his social justice with Darrius Stewart in 2015. There tends to be a wash, rinse, and repeat cycle, and I want to know from you, how do we discontinue the cycle of a young Black man getting killed by police, the town then getting upset about it, rioting, may even potentially turning violent, then media takes notice of it, then there are promises that are made, promises that doesn't seem to come fruition, things calm down, and then it's seemingly come until another cycle happens again. So how do we get out of this cycle of years and decades of the same thing repeating itself?
Look, Amy, that's a fantastic question. It might take me the entire time that we have left to try to unpack it, but I'll try to do this reasonably. First, I think what we lose is what Africana studies professors like Greg Carr would call the momentum of memory. So earlier I described how people used to teach about the race riots of the 60s in Benton Harbor public schools. But now so many people grow up in Benton Harbor in the midst of those conditions where that stuff is still in the air and in the water and in the pavement, but have no concept of the connection between what was happening in the past and what's happening in the present, which also means if somebody is courageous enough or compassionate enough to try to do something about what's happening in the moment, they usually feel like they are starting from scratch. So they don't have that momentum of memory where you can call into account what people said and promised in times past and what did or did not come to fruition in the present. And then that way you can kind of escalate the progress or advance the progress in ways that you won't be able to do if you keep starting from ground zero. And that not only happens in Benton Harbor or Memphis or Chicago or Baltimore. I mean, this has happened all across the country. It's like every time there's a high profile occurrence, whether it is a police involved shooting, whether it is an issue of white supremacist or white nationalist terrorism, it's almost like we keep starting from ground zero and running the same script that I think you talked about. And I think media, and I definitely, I hate to, I don't hate to, I know what I'm about to do is invert your podcast and get you to tell some of your story, but I think it's valuable about how you get into journalism in the first place. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, like that's how we met. And I was so excited. I was so enthused to see you at that press conference asking a very critical question in a moment that was very crucial. And then to know that you were from Benton Harbor too, I think people need to know more about how you got in the media, because media has helped to advance this insomnia where people are just sleepwalking. And media also has served to advance several of the stereotypes that tend to justify some of the injustice that happens to Black people. So part of what I did when we first started organizing around justice for Darrius Stewart, who was a teenager who was shot and killed by a Memphis police officer, is challenge media to stop advancing some of these stereotypes and some of these tropes. And so between the lack of the momentum of memory, because it's hard to get access to some of these stories about what has happened in times past, and the insomnia, or what we might even call the complacency, because at some point people feel so defeated. It's like, it doesn't matter what I do, this is what they're going to do anyway, this is just how it is, so let me go ahead and get mine and try to do the best I can with what I have. And who really cares about, a collective or communal advancement? And then you have mainstream media, especially, and I hope you can speak to what you've encountered since you've been in media across the country. But you got mainstream media that makes it more difficult to do some of the deep dives in advocacy, because I've seen them, whether it was Darrius Stewart, whether it was Tyree Nichols more recently. I've seen major media, mainstream media, whether it was local or whether it was national, kind of like come in and not really be concerned about getting to the truth. We're being more concerned about sensationalizing or creating a media spectacle that might run ratings up. But for people on the ground who are really trying to do work to improve the conditions, we end up having to fight against misrepresentation in media. I'll give you one example, and then I'll pitch it to you, and hopefully you could talk. Was murdered by the police department. And it started going national, 5 police officers, 5 black officers, so there was a lot of conversation about that. I remember doing interviews on, PBS, CNN, NBC, and local outlets. And then I remember hearing mainstream media start talking about Memphis being on the edge as we were awaiting to see whether or not the district attorney was going to file charges. And sis, I'm telling you, the way that they presented it had me on edge. I'm like, am I missing something? Because I'm living in Memphis. I'm here on the front lines. I'm in the trenches. What are they talking about Memphis on edge? Who are they talking to? But what that was doing was creating a certain type of energy around it that was locking eyes onto these mainstream media outlets. But what it was not doing was accurately portraying the story of what was happening on the ground, because many of us had already been in direct contact. I can tell you this, and I don't think this is breaking news, but I definitely hope people will come to your podcast and hear me share this in ways I hadn't shared it elsewhere. But while they were saying that, people like me and other faith leaders and community leaders were already in conversation with the district attorney. We already knew that the charges was going to be filed. We were just discussing how to roll it out. But since mainstream media wasn't doing a deep dive on that, what they were doing was sensationalizing what they anticipated was going to happen. And it was almost like they were disappointed when the city didn't go up in flames. But they didn't do the necessary work to understand the deeper context of what was happening. So if you have a lack of momentum of memory and people don't know what has happened in time past and how it's connecting to the present and how to build upon those advocacy and activism and organizing initiatives, if you have people who are complacent or suffer from insomnia and they just sleepwalking, or if you have media that is so irresponsible that it doesn't do the deep dives, I think that's when you end up on what I call that unholy hamster wheel, where you just keep repeating the same cycles and don't seem to be making much progress.
You said a lot. But speaking, if we back up some before I go into some of the questions that he asked about my journey in media, when I walked up to ask Reverend Jesse Jackson a question, my question was in a sense, we've marched, we protested, we repeated these cycles over and over again, but yet here we are. What else can we do differently that our ancestors haven't already done? And Reverend Jesse Jackson said in so many words that we have to put our buying power behind our initiatives. That's where we fall short, is that we go out and vote, but there is no black dollar behind those politicians that we put into office, or that we're not acquiring enough asset in order to be heard. And so those were some of the things that he spoke about. But my thing is, moving forward into how I got into media, we mentioned the riot of 2003 by T-shirt. I remember watching at 11 years old, and I was amazed at just how many eyes were on my little bitty city of 10,000 people. And from there, Jennifer Granholm, by day 3, Jennifer Granholm had brought in former President Jimmy Carter, and they were saying, well, we're just going to start rebuilding things. And once they started—
Was Granholm the governor at the time?
She was the governor at the time, yes. I think she's now the energy secretary now. But at the time she was the governor, and she came in and quelled the energy in the city. I said we're going to start rebuilding things. That's how we got homes for Habitat. Former President Jimmy Carter came in and he started actually building houses himself. And a lot of those things, part of our city was rebuilt from the energy that the people expelled. And I was amazed that if we put our voices on the forefront, there were things that would get done. And so that was part of my initiative of wanting to go into journalism, was putting more ostracized voices out on the forefront. What I learned, however, that when you got into media, it was not that simple, because a lot of times they don't want to hear my voice, or they don't want to hear someone who looks like me voices. A lot of times I get into media and there is a battle that's there about changing the narrative. I remember I worked at a station and we were talking about inmates, but all the inmates that you've seen in the video were just Black people. And I was upset because Black people aren't the only people that go to jail. And so I said, well, I'd rather we not show any inmates than to show only inmates that are Black. So those are some of the things that, even though they're not minor things, changed over time creates a bigger change. And so a lot of my thing with media is that I always said that I don't want to be the journalist that has a microphone in the face of a community that's upset. That is a disservice, because again, like you mentioned, that is for sensationalism, that is for the shade room, that is for TMZ, that is not the original of journalism. And so for me, when I in the thrust of a breaking news story, or a story that really has a community in the throes, I don't want to put a camera in the community's face. To me, that's a disservice. I think first and foremost, journalists, we have to feed the beast. And the way that journalism is set up now is not set up to reflect the community in this best of light. It's set up to, as you say, the community is on edge because it wants to grab eyes. Journalism now needs to compete with the internet. And the way that they compete with the internet is to sensationalize everything, or to add a little razzle dazzle when it's not needed. And that's where the distrust in the community comes in at with media, because the way media runs is not set up in a way to accurately reflect. And that is why this podcast for me is being started, so that way you can get your news in a sense that's not rushed. The news is not meant for viral headlines. It's actually meant to get to the meat of the matter.
You know what I've done, and I don't know if you can recall this, for the brief time you were working with one of the local stations here, but oftentimes, and I learned this early on in my stint in activism, as people started requesting me to do interviews with the media more and more. Like, I would remember early on doing, a 30-minute interview, and then see the story and they taking, 15, 20 seconds of what I said. And there would be some times where I felt like, to your point about, getting a slower pace insofar as the content is concerned, I'd be like, man, I said so much stuff that I feel like people need to hear, but y'all only cut it to. So I started asking for the raw video. I was like, give me the raw interview and let me put it out. So there's a lot of stuff on some of my social media stuff, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and it's like the raw, uncut version of the interview that I did with, you know, ABC 24 or Fox 13 or, you know, Action News 5 or WRAG. I'm like, give me the whole thing and then just let me put it out there. I understand you have to cut it because there are time constraints in the newsroom, and nobody can speak to that like you can, because you know you were a producer, you know, so you really know about what some of that process is like. But you also, based upon what you just articulated, understand the value of getting a deeper and more thorough narrative and story out there about what's happening. And so that was just one of the things that I started to do, was like, hey, I know you got to cut it, you know, reporter X, send me the, if you can check with your news producer, send me the whole raw thing and let me put it out there myself. I think that you know, provides us an opportunity to get that slower pace, deeper, more thorough narrative out there too.
I think that's actually a great idea, to ask for the raw, because you're able to create your own narrative outside of what the news create. And I think that is important, that a community, if a community wants to change its narrative, then it needs to start with the person that's actually speaking. So before you allow the news camera to come into your home, there needs to be a strategy that's there. Because again, there is only a time frame limited for what the producer is going to allow the reporter to add into the story. And it may not be the story that you all intended for it to be said. So news is meant to create a new angle and a new angle and a new angle. That's all that we're after, is a new angle. And that may not be, that may differ from the very beginning, the very strategy or the very story from where it started from. And it's very important that before you speak in front of the camera, there is a consensus that this is what we want to be told. Because you could say something and then they can go to your next door neighbor and it's completely different than what you intended to put out. And then now the media can spin so many different stories, because now I have two neighbors that says two different things. So community needs to do better, in my opinion, with having a consensus. Community also community also needs to do better, in my opinion, with changing their own narrative. So not only making sure that their stories are cohesive from one neighbor to the next neighbor, but making sure that every day they go out there with the intentions of, this is the only story that the news is going to find for us. So if you say news only produce bad things in my community, well, then you only need to show good things. So if you're if you are hiding great things in your community, you're doing a disservice to your community, because we know that news is only after something that's going to hit the headline. Whether you as a community need to do better with making sure that the great things are the biggest headline that's in your community.
I honor what you're saying, especially from your perspective, and I'm also curious about how viable that is, because number one, I think even though we might live in neighborhoods and communities, most of our neighborhoods and communities are not integrated enough in terms of our daily lives, such that we can actually shape a collective narrative. And so if the average journalist just walks down the street and interviews, you know, 4 different families, you're probably going to get 4 different perspectives. And with the power of the newsroom, you're able to shape that into a narrative as you want it to be. So I think what you're saying is valuable and might even be a little bit idealistic. But I also think it's important for us to try to hold accountable the larger media outlets. But you also bring up something that makes me think about some of the downfalls or pitfalls of community leaders and faith leaders and stuff like that as it relates to media, because some of us are so thirsty to just get on there that we're willing to say any and everything, and oftentimes we don't understand that we're ill-equipped to help advance a more positive, or maybe even not more positive. Maybe what needs to be advanced is not something that's positive, but definitely something that's true. And I think what ends up happening is you get such a shallow or superficial media spectacle that it becomes people's version of the truth, even though it's only a snippet or a soundbite. And so for us, what I've tried to encourage community leaders and faith leaders to do is be a lot more, to your point, strategic about how you engage in these interviews. It has to be something other than your 15 seconds or 15 minutes of fame. Like for me, it is always about what is the larger effort or initiative that we're trying to advance? Not just the narrative, not just the story, but what's the end goal insofar as a critical campaign is concerned, whether it is about criminal justice reform, whether it's about voter empowerment and engagement, whether it's about education, and access, or whether it's about labor and wages and jobs, or whether it's about holding government accountable, whatever that is, that's the thing that I and the people who I'm connected to should be trying to advance whenever we're in front of a camera. But you got people who simply want to build their personal brand. This is something you talked earlier about, the TMZ and the shade room of it all. So people want to go viral so bad, they'll do and say ridiculous stuff just to go viral, even if they know it's not true, but they think it'll end up getting them a whole lot of likes, clicks, retweets, shares, and follows. So ultimately, we have to have a stronger moral compass. And so this is where I have to tell people all the time, the work that people see me engaged in is grounded in my vocation, my commitment to my faith tradition, my commitment to God and Jesus, the Black Messiah, my commitment to Black people, my commitment to Black liberation. That's what you hear me articulating in every interview, even in this podcast, right? Like ultimately, that is what I'm after. The rest of this stuff is just strategic maneuvers to try to get us there collectively. So I don't care if somebody won't invite me to speak. I don't care if somebody won't interview me if they think what they are after is something other than what my deepest convictions and commitments are, because ultimately I'm a pastor and I have to represent my faith community. I have to represent my God. I have to represent my family in ways that can be valuable. And sometimes that means sacrificing the 15 seconds or the 15 minutes of fame for a broader platform or opportunity on down the road. Or sometimes you just don't get the platform or opportunity at all. But if it collectively advances the people, if it helps us to get free, I think that should be the ultimate commitment.
I think you said a word mentioning holding our faith leaders or our leaders in general more accountable, because a lot of us are in communities where the leaders are after what they call tithing, but are we tithing to a greater cause in the community, right? Because tithing is more than just giving money. Tithing is also giving your time, giving your commitment, staying loyal to a bigger cause. All of that is grouped into tithing. And when I mention are your neighbors are in consensus, that all of that will have to fall on who it is that you're following, will make sure that you all will remain aligned. Because in order, how do you battle a big giant like the media? The only way you can battle something like the media again is, are you all aligned, and is there discernment in the things that are being said? Are the people that you're following, are they in it for themselves, or are they in it for are they short-sighted for today, or are they a visionary for tomorrow? And it seems like we tend to get behind leaders who lead us into a lake of fire. Okay, like Martin said, he fears that he's leading his people into a burning house, where we are in the burning house. The house is on fire. Okay, but we're looking to a little ounce of water here and there, and as soon as we reach out to that water dries up. So how would you tell a group of people who say, well, I'm tired of following leaders, they don't know what they're talking about, I'm just going to do my own thing? So now there's divisiveness that's being created because there is one group pinned against the other group. Everybody wants the same thing, but because it's said differently, or because it's went at it differently, now there is divisiveness. How do...
But sis, everybody doesn't want the same thing. We got to stop selling that lie to our people.
So everybody don't
want
I'm clear. Clean water, good food, finances. So they don't want to be killed by the police. You wouldn't say all of those aren't the same things?
What I would say to that is this: there are people who want that, but only want that for themselves. They don't want that for everybody.
Gotcha.
There are people who believe that because of, maybe decisions that individuals made, or what we would now know as like coincidence and misfortune, right? Things that's arbitrary. I think it was what's my guy's name? One of the hip hop artists, Big Crit, who said, you won geography lottery, right? like you just so happen to be born in this place at this time to these people, and now you think you deserve some of the privileges and other people don't. You think clean water, good education, livable wage jobs are all privileges and not rights.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying when I say, everybody.
I agree with
right.
you.
So everybody doesn't want the same thing, and certain people only want it for themselves. So it's so individualistic. It's like they say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And what I hear you saying is we need this collective and comprehensive campaign that has everybody in the community in mind. And I'm saying to you, sis, that there are faith leaders, there are preachers, there are even people with high profiles who do not share that deep conviction. So you got people, especially faith leaders, who have charisma. And so you get people to follow them because they're charismatic, but they don't have consciousness. Damn sure don't have Black consciousness. Many of them don't have character, or a character that can, maintain that public persona. Many of them don't have competence, right? They some of them just don't even know how government works. People don't know how a bill becomes a law. People don't know which person in the community is ultimately responsible and should be held accountable for certain things. So if you don't have character and you don't have competence, you don't have consciousness, and all you have is charisma, that means you're a victim of celebrity culture. And that's what I think is really compromising the progress of our people collectively. It's like people don't care about collective campaigns. They care about individual celebrity. They want to be at the forefront. They want to have the spotlight. They believe with celebrity comes endless resources that lack any measure of accountability or responsibility. So no, sis, I don't think that there are enough of us who are after the same things. And I'm saying what is really sad is when you have faith leaders who should be grounded in ethics surrounding love and justice and grace and mercy and equity, but ultimately are, to your point, using religious tropes and ideologies, from tithing to baptism to prayer to all of these things, simply as conduits to get access to personal prosperity, popularity, and pleasure. I think we got to do better than that. And I think what we also have to do, going back to the notion of complacency and talking about accountability across the board, I know a lot of people who get off condemning and critiquing the church, but never acknowledge that the church has become what it is, in large part because the people who should be investing their time, their talent, and their treasure in it, and holding the faith leaders accountable to the standard by which they're serving the broader community, have simply stepped away because they want this radical individualism. They want to be able to move in ways that they aren't accountable to anybody. So when people often say, I've taught this in my classes, when people say stuff like I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, niggas is lying. You are religious, but you are just adhering to or bowing at the altar of the religion of radical individualism. But you still want all of what you believe to be the perks of eternal life, if you will, through this idea of spirituality. But no, there is no spirituality that's true to the origins of our African ancestors, that is disconnected from every other thing that God has created in the universe, including your neighbor, nigga. So you got to be connected to a larger community with your spiritual practice, but you don't want to be held accountable to any standard because you think you should be so radically individualistic and such a celebrity that can't nobody tell you nothing. So you got enough blame to go around, Amy, is what I'm saying. But I hope and pray, and the work that I'm committed to is to call all of us into account. But I think sometimes we spend so much time with faith leaders trying to blame community members for being apathetic, and community members trying to blame faith leaders for having too much prestige and power, that we end up allowing the oppressor to run circles around us. And that's the thing I'm trying to offset in my efforts and initiatives.
Okay. So say a community say, all right, we want to rid everyone that's not collectively down for essentially what we want to better our community. What does that look like for a community to take those steps to renew itself in a way that stops the oppressor from running circles around them?
I think you start with regaining the momentum of memory. See what the elders and the ancestors did that was productive, right? Start there. And also be honest about the fact that these things don't have, like, we didn't get to this point overnight, so we're not gonna get out of it overnight either. It's like folks want, the 3-step process to undo 400 years of oppression in 15 minutes. It's not gonna happen like that. So you got to be committed to what one author calls, his name is George Peterson. He has a book called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And so by that, I mean, you got to research the origins of the oppression, and you got to be committed to what George calls a long obedience in the sand, that we didn't get in this position or condition overnight. And so there are no easy fixes or quick solutions of getting out of it. Our problems are comprehensive, so our answers and our solutions have to be comprehensive. But here's something I feel like we can do more immediately that we don't do. Instead of spending the bulk of our time and energy amplifying the people we feel like are doing it wrong so that we can condemn and critique them, we should spend more time amplifying the people who we feel are doing it right and support and compliment them. But it is easier right now to build a platform tearing somebody down than it is lifting somebody up. So somebody will talk about many of the more high-profile preachers or faith leaders or civil rights leaders or whatever, and talk about what they're doing wrong and they this and that. But find the one that you feel is doing it right and put your support behind them. But again, if what you are after is radical individualism that you think disconnects you from any communal standard of responsibility and accountability, then you want to do whatever you can to justify your individualism. So now you say, I don't go to church, or I don't participate, or you even lie and say, I don't do politics. Nigga, yes, you do. You do politics, and here's how I know. If you see a speed limit, you are going to adhere to it to some degree. You might go over it, but you ain't generally trying to do 50 in a 35. And if you are doing 50 in a 35 and those blue lights flash behind you, the politics say pull over, and you're going to pull over. Not only that, the politics say whatever ticket the police officer writes you because of the political policy, you got to go down to the courthouse and either pay a fine or try to contest it. Nigga, you do politics, okay? But you want to be perceived as somebody who is self-made and unbeholden to nobody, even though you end up in schools that you did not build, riding down roads that you did not pave, often living in houses that you probably ain't even build yourself, right? So all of us do politics. All of us do community engagement to some degree. So we'd be better off acknowledging the ways that we do it and then committing to the communal standard of responsibility and accountability. Those are things that I feel like we need to start mapping out. And again, I think instead of trying to bite the whole elephant in one bite, you have to start picking out in your communal context, what are the issues you are most passionate about that you feel like you can move the needle on in some reasonable amount of time, because none of us in our lifetime is going to be able to solve all of the problems. You can definitely help to push the needle in the right direction on a problem that you're passionate about. Then you got to train up somebody else and pass the baton to them.
So you mentioned oppression, and what I tend to hear mostly online, and I would love for you to speak to it, that Black people aren't oppressed until it, because they do everything else they want to do. If they want to go out of town, they want to spend all their money, they do all these things. Black people are only oppressed when it's time to actually get something done. And then that's when, oh, the man holds me back. But the man doesn't hold them back from having all the kids. The man doesn't hold them back from taking all the trips. But when it comes to actually getting work done in the community, they will say, well, then that's when oppression is attached to me, but it's not attached to me when it comes to me doing the will that I want to do. What do you say to those people who have that argument?
What I say is that I'm sick of the way we oversimplify the complex realities of Black folks' oppression.
Okay.
It's almost like saying, okay, you don't have cancer because you still eat sweets. You find time to eat sweets, so I know you don't have cancer. Or you don't need chemotherapy because you exercise. You got time to exercise, you must not have cancer. I mean, some of this stuff is just so oversimplified that it kind of makes me sick to my stomach. Anybody who has studied the development and the evolution of social and political policies, from housing to education to the environment to labor, would recognize that regardless of what Black folks are doing with our money and how many Jordans we buy, number one, you can save up all of the money that you were buying Jordans with, and it still won't amount to the amount of money that you are being cheated out of because you are forced to work jobs that pay less than livable wages. And somebody can do that math. Or the amount of taxation you are under because you are redlined in a community where the property values are systemically depreciating. So unless somebody would consider those broader structural and systemic realities, I don't really have a lot of stomach for the notion that you're not oppressed or you're only oppressed when he's no. Even if I'm not acknowledging the oppression, it does not mean that it's not there. And it's a sad state of affairs to blame oppressed people for being oppressed instead of blaming the oppressors for oppressing. Now, having said that, that is true. And what is also true is we have collectively and communally seem to have lost the notion of shared sacrifice. We do think freedom is free. Or what does that TikTok meme say? Get somebody else to do it. So it's like, yeah, that protesting or that demonstrating or that civil rights activism, Pastor Earle will do that. You know, that's what Pastor. No, all of us have a role in this. The elders and ancestors sang a song that said, "Must Jesus better cross alone and all the world go free?" And the answer is no. There's a cross for everybody. There's a cross for you and there's a cross for me, which is to say, all of us should be willing to sacrifice something for the common and greater good of our community. We have lost that. But just because we've lost that does not mean we are not oppressed until, you know, a police officer kills a Black man or something of that nature. If you simply do the math, even though, so they talk about how much, two things that people bring up: the trillions of dollars that Black folks spend in the economy, right? I wonder if they factor in how much of those trillions come from like Black billionaires, like Oprah and Beyonce and Jay-Z. And that's not to say that all of it comes from them, but you know, I think some of it is overblown insofar as how much we are contributing with our nickels and dimes at department stores, okay? Because you can take somebody's closet in Benton Harbor, and I'm talking about people who probably spend a whole lot of money on their clothes, and it still won't compare to the amount of money that we lose because we don't have equitable contracts coming through city government. The other thing that I think is misleading is when people say stuff like, The dollar in the Jewish community circulates 17 times. The dollar in the Asian community circulates 13 times. And the dollar in the black community, as soon as we get it, yeah, because of the systemic and structural inequity. Because I could spend money in my neighborhood, I could walk up the street to the gas station. But the reason black folks can't own gas stations is because our credit is genuinely shot, because we don't have the same economic floor as our white or Asian and Jewish counterparts do. Or I could take my business plan into Regions Bank. No, Regions is Memphis. I meant to say Chase Bank. I could take my business plan into Chase Bank, and it's going to be scrutinized in ways that if somebody from St. Joe or if somebody from Collierville takes their business plan into one of the local financial institutions, it's not going to be met with the same level of scrutiny. So I can walk up the street to the grocery store, to the corner store, to the gas station, and yeah, my money goes out of the neighborhood, because the lending institutions, through redlining and otherwise, and other structural and systemic hurdles, have allowed other community or other ethnic groups to come into my community and own property in ways that I can't. So we got to stop demonizing our people for trying to figure out ways to maintain some level of sanity and dignity in a country, in a culture, in a context, in a system, and a structure that is hell bent on anti-blackness. So these things are literally in the water, but we tend to believe it's only because of the individual and independent decisions that black folks make every day. That's just not true.
You spoke a lot to it. And you mentioned about going to the gas station down and it's owned by maybe the local Indian. But what's not making headlines is in Detroit, there were 3 or 4 gas stations, and these are just the ones they found, that were still running without a license. And they've been running for years and years on end, and they never had a license. Nothing was valid. They just opened up shop, and it was never questioned until maybe something felonious went down, and that's what put the eyes on the gas station. So that's very interesting that you will bring that up, that we're not afforded the same leisures to set up shop, whether legally or illegally, and allow it to be overlooked. And so that's something that's really interesting to bring up. Before we come to a close, I did want to talk about how you mentioned from the very beginning that if you can make it in a city like Benton Harbor, if you can make it in a city like Memphis, you can make it anywhere. How can Black people, or anyone for the matter, that's essentially pulling themselves up from their bootstraps, how can they take the things that they lack in their community, but they gain in moral context? Because I may not have the ability to pay for something, but now I learn how to build it on my own. How can they take those things and apply it in the greater world? Because, we tend to have, a lot of our people tend to get landlocked in their communities. They get fearful of leaving or their community. They get fearful of their friends no longer having them as a friend if they leave them behind for something better. How can they take the things that they learned in such dire constraints and apply it to a global spectrum? How do small town people, or people that are in areas that are redlined for oppression, how can they make themselves competitive on a global level?
Man, that's a loaded question, Amy. It's fantastic, because some of it I'm curious about insofar as what the impact of the internet and social media has done to, at least even in small towns or small markets, what has it done to globalize our consciousness? Because think about it, like I graduated from Benton Harbor in '96. And so the internet was just not starting to even emerge as a thing. And so I think that small-minded mentality could have been a lot more pervasive than it might be now, because we didn't have immediate one click, one scroll, timeline access to something that was happening across the globe, where you can witness it and have a different perspective or a different concept. For us, it took, having to physically travel to certain spaces and certain places. And, back then, Chicago, oftentimes only 90 miles away, or Detroit, what I think 120, 140 miles away, seemed like a whole different world, right? Like it just seemed like it was in another, a time zone, another realm or something like that. Where now, I mean, you could be so close because you are one click away. I just wonder how that may have impacted that concept or that mentality. So I don't know, but I do know that there has been at least a perception of a small-minded mentality that always leads us to believe there are limited resources and limited opportunities. But then we still have these unique success stories like yourself. I think about Mayor Marcus Muhammad. I think about my dear brother Danny Tate Jennings, who is now one of the principals there. I think about people like Wilson, who has, expanded businesses all over the country, went to New York and been in Denver and, things of that nature. I think about so many people who have done so much that it makes me feel like they often say there are 6 degrees of separation. I think there are fewer degrees of separation for Black folks, and even fewer degrees of separation for Black folks in Benton Harbor. So the relationship equity is a big thing for me. And that is simply trying to make sure you foster these healthy and whole relationships that can provide you with opportunities beyond the scope of your immediate proximity and vicinity. So again, who would have known that you and I would meet in Memphis, at a press conference in 2021 or 22? Which one was it? You remember?
2022.
Yeah, who would have thought that we would have met there, in 2022, had it not been for work that I was doing, work that you were doing, and relationships that we had forged with people along the way that put us in the same proximity at that particular time. And then you were able to call people, I've been able to call people, and we now know people who know people and that sort of stuff. And I'm not saying, when social media first started, as I recall it, Facebook especially, it was deemed not social media, but a social networking site. And it was intended to get people connected in ways that they would not have been connected without it. It helped me in 2006 and 7 and 8 reconnect with classmates from 96, people who went to Benton Harbor in the 90s and who were in Dallas or San Diego or Atlanta or Indianapolis or Baltimore. Didn't you went to school in Baltimore, right?
No, I started off at Pine Bluff, University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, and then I finished at A&M.
See, look at that. So now that UAPB is Pine Bluff, FAMU is in Tallahassee, I believe it is.
You're right,
What I was thinking of, I was thinking of people who went to Morgan State in Baltimore.
I know several people from Benton Harbor to Morgan State.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sister right now who has the Benton Harbor CDC.
Yeah.
Who watch this, and going back to relationships, I met her because she's attending a church in Baltimore that I ended up preaching at.
Look at that.
So again, what breaks us out of the small-mindedness is knowing that if you cultivate righteous relationships, they can end up taking you somewhere anywhere. I'll leave you with this. Here's how I end up in Memphis on a basketball scholarship. There was a guy who had a scouting service, and he was scouting people in the conference that Lake Michigan College is in. Okay. And he saw me play a game at Kalamazoo Valley Community College. He came up to me, his name was Walter Jackson. He came up to me and asked me if anybody had been recruiting me. And at the time, all of the schools in Michigan that were even considering me, they were only considering me for a partial scholarship because I was a academic risk. Okay. Now I got a PhD, but I was an academic risk.
Get that.
And so he knew the legendary coach Jerry Johnson at Lemoyne-on College, and he had been sending people from that conference, that junior college conference with Lake Michigan College, Kellogg Community College, Kalamazoo Valley, Grand Rapids Community College, all of them, Lansing Community College. That conference, he was sending them to the HBCU conference in the South, the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Conference, SIAC. So sending people to Lane where you went. Did you? No, you didn't go to Lane. Somebody else went to Lane from Benton Harbor. A bunch of us went to Lane from Benton Harbor. So he's sending people to Lane, Lemoyne, Kentucky State, Morehouse, Clark. And so he made a phone call to Jerry Johnson on my behalf. And Jerry Johnson had never seen me dribble or shoot a basketball. But because Walter Jackson called him and spoke highly of me, Coach Johnson called me and offered me a full ride, sight unseen.
Wow.
So what gets you out of that small-minded mentality is seeing how large the world is whenever you cultivate righteous relationships. And now, because of the power of social media and the internet, you can actually, if you're a stand-up guy or a stand-up girl or a stand-up human being, you can actually cultivate those righteous relationships with people all over the world.
Wow. I want to close it, but there is one thing that stuck out to me that I have to ask you. So you say you were an academic risk, and Black boys tend to be academically challenged, and it's probably set up that way. How did you go from being average to exceptional in a system that denies you your rightful opportunity to start off that way?
That's a great question. I love to close on this too. I think there are two things in hindsight. And I'm not sure anybody ever asked me the question as pronounced as you just asked it. So I deeply appreciate it. There are two things that I think of right now. One, I'm from Benton Harbor. If you can make it in Benton Harbor, you can make it anywhere. And that perseverance, that audacity, that tenacity, all of that led me to where I was academically, and I got tired of performing at a substandard level because I knew I was better than that. I knew I had it in me, but it just didn't click. So it started to click when I got to Lemoyne because I was saying, well, actually it started to click when I was at LMC because I ended up becoming academically ineligible. And I was like, man, I've been through all of this just to get to college and get a scholarship. I ain't finna mess this up simply because I won't go to class. I mean, that's all it was. It wasn't that I had a problem with the content. It's not that I couldn't learn. Anybody who knows me knows I was one of the smartest people around. I mean, I just wasn't applying myself. But then when I felt that the things I aspired to as an athlete were being compromised because my lack of commitment in the classroom, I had to change it. But the second thing that really got me to this level is Black consciousness. When I could become more conscious of who I am and who my elders and my ancestors are, and the standard of intellectual excellence and elegance that they provided and presented, then it challenged me to walk worthy of that call. It challenged me to do a better job of handling the baton that had been passed to me. So between being from Benton Harbor and then encountering Black consciousness, especially Black liberation theology, in a way that helped me understand more clearly who I am and whose I am, those are the things that took me from being academically ineligible or academic risk to getting a PhD.
Amazing. Dr. Fisher, where can people reach out to you or even attend a church service, whether online or in person?
Yeah, Tupac said, although I'm worldwide, baby, I ain't hard to find.
Okay.
I'm on social media somewhere everywhere. Earle J. Fisher on Facebook, @pastor_Earle, that's EARLE, on Instagram and Twitter. The church is Abyssinian Baptist Church in Memphis. You can find it at Abyssinian Missionary Baptist Church on Facebook, @ABC Ministries, the #1 on Instagram. Services are virtual every Sunday. So we're hybrid on first and third Sundays, but every Sunday you can catch our live stream on the Abyssinian Baptist Church Facebook page. You could also catch snippets and things of that nature on the Instagram page. Other than that, PastorEarle25@gmail.com for anybody who wanted to send me an email. Amy, thank you for this opportunity to chop it up with my sister. I'm so proud of you. I so salute your perseverance and your progress. regarding your recovery after your accident. I see the hand of God all over you.
Thank
I
you.
trust and believe that the best in your life, insofar as your projects and your initiatives, are yet to come. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to chop it up with you, sister. BH, stand up. You understand what I'm saying?
No, okay. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Fisher, for coming on my podcast. I really appreciate it. You really spoke to me. I hope my viewers have got some from you as well. As always, you guys can catch another episode of Amy the Seventh, aka Pretty Woman Speaks, on Google, Spotify, and Apple. You can also catch this episode on YouTube as well. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Peace and love.
Peace. Thanks, sis.